Well, I am delighted to be here with you all today, and actually delighted to hear the Seamus Heaney poem, because the last time I heard that, the three of us, along with 17 other folks from the Minnesota Conference, were in our final day at Corrymeela in Northern Ireland, and so lovely to have those words be part of this experience today. I am Kevin Brown and serve as your Associate Conference Minister for Faith Formation, and had the privilege of helping coordinate an experience in Northern Ireland where we had 10 young adults from around Minnesota, from 7 of our congregations, and then 10 older adults, ranging anywhere from kind of late 30s to 80, who traveled to Northern Ireland with us, a trip that we've been planning for some time, about 18 months actually, to help bring folks from Minnesota to learn from the history, the stories, the challenges, and the deep-rooted history of peace building within all sorts of places in Northern Ireland that we had hoped would have something to teach us about our own current context of division and strife and political violence here in the US. And we could not have imagined 18 months ago when we began planning the trip how even more relevant it would be in the months following Operation Metro Surge here in Minnesota. So I'm delighted to be here with Liam and Lily to share some of the reflections of this important experience that we hope will continue to have some ripples out from the folks from 16 of our congregations and 2 congregations in Wisconsin who were part of this experience. And so we hope that this is just the beginning point of a conversation and maybe an invitation for each of you as we continue to consider what it means to be peace builders within ourselves, within our own lives, within our faith communities, within our wider community. So I've just got a couple of questions to help frame this time, but I hope this really is just much more of a dialogue and conversation. And I'm not checking my phone. This is actually where I have my questions. So I wonder if there is a particular experience from our time in Northern Ireland. I should say we visited Belfast. We spent time kind of talking with people who had been involved in a variety of ways in the conflict. We spent time at Corrymeela, an ecumenical and interfaith community that had been very active in helping bring people from the Troubles on all sides of the conflict to a beautiful place. Oh.
Can you hold the mic closer?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And then we also spent time in Derry. So to give a little bit of context about where we were, but yeah, is there a particular experience that you've held on to that has stayed with you most strongly since you've returned from the trip?
It was a full experience. So there were many moments that are sticking with me. I think that one to highlight is the visit to Derry, because during that time, yeah, I'm sure many of us have been to places where we have a tour guide and the tour guide showing us around the town. And at first, that was what I thought this experience was going to be. And then piece by piece, the tour guide kind of first foreshadowed and then eventually, came right out and told us that she is a former IRA combatant. And so there was this moment of like, oh, this mom who's showing us around her hometown is also somebody who the British government would have considered a terrorist, right? And that is a really weird moment. And so that certainly sits with me. And then hearing her story kind of come out piece by piece about the history of her family, the work that she's doing now as a peace builder, getting to talk with her son and about like the bullying that he has faced in school as somebody who, despite having direct ties to pro-Ireland, pro-unification sympathies, basically, because he and his family, he personally decided like he no longer wanted to, essentially like when he was growing up in school, because of the divisions, like 93% of folks growing up in Northern Ireland today are in a segregated school, so either a Catholic school or a Protestant school, and so only 7% of the country goes to integrated schools. So Asa, this young man, explained that basically, his mom took him to an event she was doing where he met a bunch of guys. He didn't know anything about these guys' work. He didn't know anything about their history, but he had a lot of fun meeting them. He really got to make some friends with these men who his mom knows. And then the next day they showed up in uniform, and they were soldiers. They were British soldiers. And he and his friends, as Catholics in Northern Ireland, there's like a culture of like basically fantasizing, play acting about like blowing up British soldiers. It's one of the things they do for fun as kids to create their in-group. And he no longer wanted to participate in these fantasies of violence. And because of that, it created these barriers between himself and his former friends, where he was facing then bullying for, basically said at age 11, he met these soldiers. And from age 11 to 18, he was facing ostracism and discrimination from his peers because he wouldn't participate in this culture of violence towards the UK. And so that just like really sat with me. He was 25, he's a peer of mine, and imagining 7 years of bullying because you want to be a peace builder, really wrenching. So I think that particular moment really sat with me.
On our first full day in Belfast, there were two faith leaders who came to speak with us. I completely forget their names at this point, but they were speaking about the festival that they had created, the Four Corners Festival, that specifically put on cultural events in an area that was not steeped in that culture. So they would put on not indigenous Irish, but a traditionally Irish festival in a Protestant area that was particularly more English usually, to try to force people to leave their neighborhood, to go to a different area and to interact. I do a fair amount of organizing in my local neighborhood of very similar community cultural events, and I think there's a lot more work we could do to use those events as a way to cross barriers.
I think I'll just name two pieces. One comes from Anne, the woman that Liam was talking about, who was our tour guide around Derry. And there was a point where Anne was asked a question by someone in our group. And the question was, do you think that there has been justice within the peace in Northern Ireland? And without even skipping a beat, Anne said, I don't think there will ever be justice. So someone who has dedicated their life within this peace-building movement in this place, who has kind of confronted her own kind of personal stories and the things that she had done, who has been vulnerable in working with folks who are in very different places in the conflict and built friendships, relationships. I think it was a pretty startling piece for so many of our folks, and I think coming out of our particular context in the US, where even though we know this is our life's work, I think there's still some longing, at least, for the idea that perhaps in our own lifetime there may be some places. And that just kind of shattered some of that in a really helpful way, I think. Jarring, but helpful. And the other kind of comment that came was with the Corrymeela staff, who basically said one of the ways that it works here too, and why people have been able to cross lines of difference, is we pull them from their context into this beautiful, natural third space. But we also don't set as a precondition that to participate in the conversations, you have to come to an understanding that your actions were wrong. But you do have to be willing to have the conversation around how your actions might have done harm. And again, those are really different entry points for conversation than a lot of the spaces and rhetoric that we have, at least right now. So those are a couple of the things that I'm holding on to. So I wonder, were there things, parallels that you noticed between the Northern Ireland context and our own context or contexts here, nationally or kind of within some of our communities?
I'm so glad I'm going first, because I think I'm going to take the obvious one. When we were in Derry, we went to the museum, and there were many photos of women banging trash can lids, metal trash can lids, on the street or on the sidewalk, and that was how they would alert people around them, their neighbors, that the soldiers were coming. And there were even some families have kept these trash can lids, and they're beautifully illuminated because they are a piece of their family's history, their city's history. Some have been donated to museums. And I think everyone in our group made a very quick comparison to whistles and to the proliferation of the whistles. And I think there's one in every single one of my bags now, and they're all different, and many of them are decorated. Yeah, I think that was just a very obvious and quick parallel.
Yeah, the parallels are one of the things that I struggled with, particularly early in the trip. I wasn't the conflict there, and I know this is a contrast, but the conflict there was so rooted in neighbor versus neighbor violence, right? Literally, one family in one area is attacking the family who lives just down the road from them. And in our context, it felt a lot more like an outside occupying force coming in and setting up shop in our city. And at first, that felt like a major difference. And then, as I kind of reflected on it more, it became clear that in the Irish context, the occupying force is the UK historically, right? And so they have been facing an occupation for generations. And the reason it got to neighbor versus neighbor is the colonial forces that allowed Protestants to come into largely Catholic areas and take land. So there was essentially a caste system, right? A discriminatory system where Northern Ireland was created as a Protestant government for a Protestant people, despite it also governing many, many, many Catholics. And at this point, there are more Catholics in Northern Ireland than Protestants, but it's still gerrymandered such that the Protestants have a lock on power, right? And so I think one of the other parallels, at least for me, is this moment of uncertainty, right? Where I don't know what's going to happen next here in our politics, nationally or locally. We don't know how this is going to unfold, and I think a lot of the Irish folks we met are sitting in a very similar moment of unsurety about what's going to happen. Many of the people we talk to are absolutely certain they are moving towards reunification in the next 10 years, and other folks are not certain whatsoever what that would look like or if that will happen, and have a lot of fear around the violence that could spring up if a true reunification push gains steam. So I think those components were some of the big parallels in my mind. Yeah. Did you have any major parallels, Kevin?
I think for me, it was the intertwined history and story of how well the British colonial systems and the U.S. colonial systems have continued to teach and to learn from one another. As we were hearing stories and visiting and the Museum of Free Dairy, just entwined this kind of story of tactics where one learned well from the other, but also how movements of liberation, how so much of what was going on in Northern Ireland was also informed by the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s, and also from the more militant aspects of the American Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. So on both sides of this, there was a learning. But yeah, the sharing of the colonial powers kind of playbook was so disturbingly evident. So how has this experience helped shape or shift your understandings of what it means to be a peace builder or the work of peace building more broadly?
I do a fair amount of mutual aid work in our very hyper-local neighborhood, and I think the biggest thing is that you don't have to like everyone that you're doing this work with. You don't have to be friends with everyone you're doing this work with. At the end of the day, you have to believe that everyone deserves respect, they deserve a roof, they deserve to be fed, and that doesn't necessarily mean you have to actually like them. That just means that even if you don't like them, they still have that right.
Yeah, I think some of the models of peace building that they used in Corrymeela were really helpful. I don't know. The two thoughts that really jumped out to me are Kathleen. Yes. In Derry. Kathleen's husband, Patsy, was blown up by the IRA. He was actually used as a van driver to conduct an attack on British soldiers. So he was taken from their home, he was put in a van with 1,000 pounds of explosives, and he was forced to drive that van into the walls of the city, basically. So Patsy died along with these 10 British soldiers. And he's Catholic, so Patsy and his family were Catholic, and he was viewed as a legitimate target by the IRA because he worked in the kitchens at the barracks. So he served food to the British soldiers, and so the IRA decided he was a combatant on the UK side. And so that's why he was targeted and why he was killed. His wife, Kathleen, his widow, has built a friendship with Anne, the former IRA quartermaster, and they go around together and do presentations like they did for us. And like Anne said, we're never going to get justice. Kathleen said, I'm never going to forgive. And I thought that was really incredible to hear somebody who's dedicated their life to peace building saying they're never going to forgive, right? And one of the other people in the room was an author, and he has written a lot about forgiveness. And so it was interesting to hear, his value of forgiveness in the same moment that you're hearing Kathleen say, I'll never forgive. But we also heard her say that she would, part of the reason she said she would never forgive is because she didn't want the people who killed her husband to get into heaven. And she thought that would be, they'd only be asking for forgiveness to get into heaven. And she doesn't want that. And so that was an interesting way that she was making sense of it. But she did say she would, if they ever knocked on her door asking for forgiveness, that she would invite them in and she'd make them tea and she'd sit down and have a conversation with them. And so that was an interesting, no forgiveness, but I'll make you tea, right? And we'll talk about this. She wanted to know why they did it, if they feel like it was worth it. So that component, and then as I mentioned, the model that Corrymeela presented to us was that you're in navigating these conflicts, you're constantly trying to navigate balancing mercy and justice, peace and truth. So mercy and justice are often in tension, and peace and truth are often in tension. And you need to figure out how to have space for all four of those incredibly difficult ideas within a peace-building context. So, I think that was my the toolkit that I'm taking away for peace building is it's not just about peace. It also requires truth telling. It also requires mercy. It also requires justice.
And I think just a couple of additional things. One, for me, with our time at Corrymeela, which is this incredibly beautiful place right on the north coast. I mean, it is the buildings, the property is perched just above the North Atlantic. And it brought home for me the importance of third spaces, third places, where for decades and continuing is their work of bringing folks on all kinds of sides of conflict, pulling them out of the context in which they live and providing hospitality in this incredibly beautiful place. That then allows people to get to know one another at a human level apart from the day-to-day rhythms of the conflict that they live in. And allows people to just be and play in addition to creating the kind of space in which the vulnerability might be possible to share your story. And again, to just gain some perspective. So those third spaces, I think, were something, and then just the importance of story. The work of the Theater of Witness, which both Anne and Kathleen are part of that we're talking about, was bringing people together not to do any kind of dramatic reenactment of the conflict, but to really dig into their own personal, deep narratives and bring those in to conversation with people who have a narrative that is very different and often in conflict with your own. So the power of that kind of intentional story, cultivation and sharing, I think, is still there for me about how core that could be within some of our own, peace-building work. What questions have you brought back with you and maybe are continuing to unfold for you after the trip?
Okay. My main question, I think, I had lots of questions, but one of them was around the, like Anne was saying, and a number of other folks said, like, it didn't have to be this way. You know, we didn't, like, I didn't realize the scale of the conflict. I didn't realize that it lasted for 30 years and more than 3,000 people were killed. That's just like a much larger scale of conflict than I had realized occurred. And just the deep conviction that, like, you know, we're never going to get justice. It didn't have to be this way. And my kind of wondering from that was, you know, for better or for worse, to what degree was this effective, right? Do any of the combatants feel like the violence they inflicted achieved the goals they achieved, right? If they don't feel like it was effective, then maybe that's a lesson to not do this in the future. And if they did think it was effective, then that's potentially really dangerous for this next chapter, right? And so I didn't actually hear that much about the efficacy of the militarized tactics, or, you know, trajectories for how to avoid them in the future, right? Outside of just trying to build relationships and build friendships. So that was my wondering.
I think a lot of us, especially a lot of the young people, really wanted clear action items to take home. We wanted something to do. And I think the main thing that we ended up talking about and going in circles about a little bit was how to form that community, how to talk across the aisle, whether it's political or cultural or religious, and we never came up with a good answer for that. In terms of how do we reach out to someone if they, whether because of, again, our religion or our race or our gender identity, they don't believe that we should have rights. Are those the people we should be reaching out to? Should we be reaching out to people more in the middle or more convincible? And if so, how do we go about doing that? If we don't feel safe or we don't want to enter their space, how can we encourage them or welcome them into our space? And we still don't have a clear answer. It's a very hard question.
Questions, Kevin?
I would say going right along with where both of you are, but especially kind of Lily's, you know, that wondering is, I think, structurally, sitting from a conference standpoint and from you know, a wider United Church of Christ and from our partners, what is our responsibility to help create those third spaces where it isn't you come to my space or I come to your, where neither feels safe and they don't feel like they're trustworthy spaces. But underneath that too is, then what are the relationships that we have to build? Because the thing that Corrymeela has maintained throughout their history is that they have been viewed as a trustworthy partner and place by many sides of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And I don't know that we as the United Church of Christ, or most of our religiously affiliated organizations right now, whether they are on the more liberal progressive side of the Christian faith or a more conservative side of the Christian, feel trustworthy for a lot of folks on all sides of the conflicts here. And so what is the work of finding that place? And I think kind of going into that, are there implications? I think because that's my personal wondering, but also about our kind of community and collective wondering. So I don't know if you've had any thoughts about kind of the communities that you're a part of. I mean, this faith community here, but the various other communities in terms of this work.
Yeah. So we're going to need to wrap up our conversation. And I don't know, I think that my hope is that specifically the young folks that I met on the trip will stay in conversation with each other. I think that's kind of my main takeaway, to just see more spaces with those folks in it.
Yeah, since getting back, I've thrown myself even deeper into Zion Community Commons in our local neighborhood, which is a church that has transitioned into being a community space. So they are a community space first and a church second. And it's a very interesting model.
Well, thank you all for listening to us. I think that's what we've got today. Yeah.